Hi guys, Mr. Ridgway here for our second part on World War I. And as you can see, both with the title and our wonderful propaganda poster over here, we are talking about the home front in this lesson. And by the way, this is an anti-German poster, so this kind of hurts my heart. But we are going to be looking at the home front in World War I. So, the questions that we're going to be looking at here is how does a nation conceptualize the idea of obligation or duty during wartime, and also how do citizens protest against coercion from either the state or the public, their friends, their peers, and then really just kind of their entire society. Alrighty, so here's the big picture, as it says right here, and I'll just read it. This mini lesson looks at how the U.S. as a nation and the public emphasized patriotism and obligation during the time of World War I. Please note that in the U.S. in 1917, the majority of the country supported going to war, which meant that cultural expectations have shifted from prior years, and this is what we're going to examine. Alrighty, so the first thing you want to make sure you understand, and shout out to Christopher Capizzola, who I've got a quote here from, he's done some really good research on this, is the idea of coercive volunteerism in World War I. So World War I, besides the Civil War, was the first war that the United States instituted a draft, and this was called the Selective Service Act. Now, this is a paradox, because if something's selective, meaning you choose, but it's a service act that you are expected to do, because the draft was mandatory, it doesn't make any sense. It's both a choice for you to do it, but then also universally applied to every male. And so what is kind of really interesting about this is we get this interesting mix in the United States of where there's this culture that is expecting everybody to participate, but then there's also some people who resist, and there is kind of then this weird kind of world we get in. And so what we see early on is that supporters of the war effort are going to use a strategy and really to kind of this culture that Capizzola has called coercive volunteerism, to get people to comply. And what's really cool, and he's done a lot of documentation on this, is we see something called slacker raids. This is a good example of people who were draft dodgers, and we'll talk about what slackers are here in a second. But this American Protective League was basically, in some cases, almost this group of vigilantes that goes around and tries to insist that people participate in the war effort, that they're not dodging the draft, that people are, rationing and those kind of things. So, moving on from that, I'm going to actually read here a quote from Capizzola here on how the APL, that American Protective League, did its course of volunteerism. So, the APL had an ambiguous legal status. League men embarked on unwarranted searches and seizures, detained and arrested draft-age men without charges, and intimidated allegedly disloyal Americans, and broke up strikes. Sometimes deputized en masse by the local police, sometimes warned that they had no right to make arrests, operatives rarely paused over the difference. Quote, Bolsheviki, socialists, incendiaries, IWW's Industrial Workers of the World, that's a union, Lutheran treason talkers, Russellites, Burgerites, all the otherites, religious and social fanatics, third sex agitators, long-hair visionaries, and work haters from every race in the world. So they're kind of just going after anybody who's not buying into this patriotic spirit that is expected of everyone in World War I, but also that the society wants them to have. And that's why we call it coercive volunteerism. It's like volunteering somebody for something, if you've heard of that kind of like metaphor that's used today. So how does making private coercion, how does this, what does this kind of look on the ground besides the slacker raids by the APL, okay? And so this was done through actually something that we've talked about before. So early on, we said that one of the ways that females get interested, well, not just interested, but actually the better word there is involved in the greater public sphere is through voluntary associations. Okay, and they're going to use these things. So the things that had kind of gotten women involved in society as a whole are now going to be turned to use that to coerce people into participating in the war effort. This is also done through individuals' own effort. So I'll give you some examples here. The most obvious example of the APL is the APL for a volunteer association. And then individual efforts by women, we see lots of things like women going house to house and asking and writing letters to each other where it's like, oh, is Johnny's son 18? He looks like he hasn't signed up. And so that was looked down as a very there's a lot of gossip and public shaming, especially in newspapers. And it's actually really interesting to go read newspapers at the time, and you can see like these little articles where people are writing and kind of like calling each other out in public. Now, this is where I guess we can talk about slackers as well. So slackers was the name given to people who dodged the draft. But there were also a group, okay, and I'll kind of shrink my video here so you can see this, called conscientious objectors. And these were people who opposed participating in World War I for political or religious reasons. And there's actually not too many of them in World War I, really estimated around to be a few thousand. Now, what's interesting about this is that in this culture of coercive volunteerism, where people are expected to be a part of, and people are expected to want to be a part of this war effort, a high majority of Americans hate them, especially in this culture context of obligation and duty. And what happens is that there is, in local communities, and also on a more kind of state and then federal level, there are these boards set up called the Boards of Inquiry. And these government tribunals are essentially set up where they take these men who are conscientious objectors and they try to test to see if these people really are what they say they are, if they're just not making up these beliefs that they have to not participate. So for instance, Quakers being nonviolent would be a good example, or other people who just believe that violence is not a good example. Kind of think about like, there was a movie that recently came out about World War II about a medic who supposedly was this. And kind of what happens to these people is that these conscious objectors are ridiculed and in many cases prosecuted for not signing up for the draft or refusing to really, do certain things that other people in society hadn't or had expected of them. So this is really kind of like a question of like, what would you do in this case? And this is where things get so complicated, is because like if you're a male in this time and would you sign up for the draft? Would you be a slacker? Would you be a conscientious objector? Would you be one of the vigilantes like running around with the APL? And then as a female, like, again, these are all the choices that people have to make on the ground. Are you participating in these volunteer organizations? Are you going around and publicly shaming people, staying silent? And people have to make a choice based on their history, family involvement, their background, their level of education, and all these things. And it's an incredibly complicated environment. Now, what kind of gets even more interesting here, and we're going to kind of spend the last couple slides, is looking at how does the U.S. government also, so we kind of take like things from a private level, okay, so women, men, what are they doing in regards to the draft, the APL, volunteer associations, so that's kind of all like bottom-up things. I want to take here for like just a couple slides to look from a top-down perspective, and the first thing is freedom of speech. Now, what's really interesting is the acts that are put in this place, in some cases, are actually still there. And one of these that is put in place early on when the U.S. joins, 1917 again, is the Espionage Act of 1917. Okay, and this declares that the U.S. government has a ability to do or to restrict free but responsible, or that speech must be, free but responsible. Okay, now what you define as responsible can mean a whole lot of things. This also allows the U.S. Post Office to read mail that people were sending. They could remove anything that advocated treason, insurrection, or resistance to the U.S. And if you think, there's like quite a few things that could fall under that category. So, for example, if you had like an anti-imperialist who was calling for the U.S. to not be involved in World War I, they could pull that out of the mail. Okay, and again, this culture of duty and obligation to restrict access. You see governments start to press on local libraries to remove materials from them that people could check out that would be in some way suggestive of being an anti-war book, or maybe they were printed in German. You see lots of German books start to disappear off the shelves during this time because you wouldn't want children to be reading them. And what's really funny about this actually is that German, this kind of gets to Germany specifically here, is that Germany, or at least German culture here for quite a few years, really suffers in the U.S. because of this. So Woodrow Wilson, when the war starts here, defines all male German citizens in the U.S. that are over the age of 14 as enemy aliens. So that's a pretty direct way that you're approaching these kind of people who are living inside the country. And like there was a whole bunch of things put in place, like they couldn't live within a certain distance of military bases and other kind of like restrictions on movement that were placed on them. I mean, then that kind of like begs the question here is that who really is the enemy with all these targeted actions against German Americans? Are they being targeted because of the culture, because the people themselves are somehow suspicious, or is it because you're just targeting them because Germany is the enemy out there, and so you feel like you have to do the same thing here? I don't know. What we can kind of see, though, and this is kind of goes back to some bottom-up things as well, but also top-down enforced, okay, was that German was actually the most taught second language in school, and almost completely ends up stopped, there almost completely ends up not being taught anymore in U.S. schools, which I wonder today is if, is that a contributing reason to why German tends to be like one of the languages that's not included in most foreign language programs, across the state. German music and composers are also banned. So like Beethoven, Bach, Handel, like all of these guys, like indeed, people take it out of their jukeboxes. Well, jukeboxes maybe might be a stretch, but they take it out of their record players. You start to see like that operas tend to not play German music or German-inspired or composers that was done music that was done by those composers. So it's a lot of things. And so, in short, okay, what we're looking at is we're seeing that this culture of coercive volunteerism is both affecting society from the top down, okay, from what was being enforced by the Woodrow Wilson administration, and then also the U.S. government, and then also from the bottom up, where people, such as in these volunteer associations, were trying to seek out the people who weren't being patriotic enough or are in some way resisting. So, hopefully this video was helpful in understanding those big kind of ideas, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Bye-bye.